My father and a number of them in the Dáil would have come in my kind of reckoning, as slightly outsiders because they came from a totally different background, a totally different school of thought. And that was the original groupings who went to London as civil servants. For the first time, Irish boys, not girls, could do the exam for the civil service. My father would have been, I reckon, the story given to me was that he did the exam and passed it at 17, but that his mother said there was no way he was going to go to London and lose his head in the big city like we all would, coming to Dublin. And he would wait until the following year when he would go back with his older brother, who was also in the civil service. And he would go with him, and at least he'd have a base. And that was how he started. And he was later joined by another younger brother, and all three of them were in the service together, I gather. I often thought to go from the square in Newcastle West at the turn of the century to head for the Home Office in Whitehall must have been something that is just, it is actually life-changing. My father, my grandfather, I believe, he was a farmer, a small farmer. I'm not absolutely certain, but I think was about 18 acres, which wasn't very big, but it was very fertile and was one of the few spots in Ireland, to go back, that wasn't affected by the famine. And that, I think, was the secret of why they survived at all, is that they, while there was no wealth, absolutely no wealth and no money, there was no poverty as such, mainly because they didn't go anywhere. So that was the type of life they led. My grandfather, I believe, had absolutely no interest, from what I gather, in any sort of national politics or identity or anything. I believe in actual fact, he was a very, very, very good ploughman. And his whole interest was, apparently a group of them would go around and test in ploughing competitions. But my grandmother appears to have been the driving force. There is a story told, and I can't verify it, it's only a kind of a thing I heard, that originally she was of Protestant stock. And the money had a little bit of money. Now, whether it was sewn into the curtains or whether it was sewn into the petticoat, I don't know. But that must have been the little bit of money that sent them to the Musgrave, to Mr. and Mrs. Musgrave, who had a teaching school in Newcastle West. They were, if you like, a Protestant, but they were there, these small individual privately run schools that were run by teachers and maybe their wives, and they were penniless as well. It was only a step up from the hedge schools. But they had a school and it was here, and they specialized in this civil service exam. Now, the civil service exam was not points, it was nothing like that, it was a standard that you could sit as long as you wanted to and keep doing it. But once you passed the standard, you were in. My uncle called it one time when I was very young, the civil service standard. And these were all young boys. And when they got to London, they were all completely influenced, totally, by the people they encountered. In the civil service was extremely structured, extremely hierarchical. I mean, it was literally layered. There was no army like it. And even your outside activities would be very much watched. You wouldn't be allowed to be in pubs or football clubs or anything, but things that were cultural were actually encouraged. And strangely enough, the Gaelic League was encouraged in the civil service. in what you hear, and even they were encouraged, if they wanted to talk Irish, you could talk Hindustani if you wanted to. So it was considered cultural. And when he was there, he met just about everybody who was anybody laterally from the likes of Casement. There was a cell, the Keating branch was just one cell. And my father, I gather, was made, after a while, was made secretary or treasurer of the Keating branch. And they used to meet, I don't know if it was once a week, but actually it was probably the only social outlet they had. And they met there, where they were addressed by all sorts of people from time to time who would have been distinguished, such as Douglas Hyde and Casement, the Spring Rices, all the people in England who were, if you like, of the Irish landed gentry, Protestant types. And these had all a kind of a nationalism of their own, because at that time there was a very strong feeling amongst them of a lack of identity. When they were in Ireland, they were looked up to as Lord and Lady this and that. They were up there. But when they were in England, they were paddies. And that was part of the search for identity that was in the Gaelic League. It's only part of it. And why so much of the Gaelic League at that time in England was, if you like, run and dominated by these. My father was in this Keating branch. Now, just one story, and I think it sums it up. One day in the Keating branch in the civil service, a little man came in, just joined up for the night like you would with any historical society. A couple of weeks after, he came again. Another few weeks again, he came again, until I suppose my father or somebody would have said to him, "Good night." And just, "How are you?" And he said, "My name is Collins." And obviously, he was a man who would come all the time, and I'd get to know him. And he was a little journalist, my uncle told me, who was a little journalist who was kind of doing part-time work, had been in the Boer War. I don't know what else he did. He hadn't got any money. He was a small, delicate little man, and he gave his name as Arthur Griffith. And thereafter, Arthur Griffith became another one of my father's gods. So Arthur Griffith joined that. I have the names at home. Frank Lawless joined it. Andy O'Byrne was in it. Bulmer Hobson, Darrell Figgis. All these fellows were all in it. He was not in the volunteers or had nothing to do with anything militarily, but appears to be very high up in the IRB. Now, the IRB was a different kettle of fish, and he would have been in the IRB because the IRB, certainly in the early days, would have been nearly all entirely Protestant, upper class, the old Fenians, going back to Parnell, all that kind of thing. That's where the IRB came from. On Wednesday night, long before the Easter Rising took place, he was sent by Sean McDermott, who was also in the Gaelic League and also in the digs with him in London, and also from the London days. He was sent to go down to meet Roger Casement in Bannistrand. I utterly believe he was sent to Feenet because he was the only one who knew Roger Casement, who actually knew him, and he was going down to meet Roger Casement. Now, why he was going down to meet him, I don't know, but he's reputed to have had a very large sum of money. Where that money came from, I have no idea. What it was going to be used for, I have no idea. But the important thing was that he and Austin Stack were picked up before they ever got to Bannistrand. because he had been monitored from Dublin, and they literally just stopped the car and asked the two of them to get out. And they were brought back to Tralee. And I'm sure at that stage he was terrified. I'd say he was absolutely petrified. The two of them didn't know. There was no Easter Rising. They didn't know it was going to take place. The two of them were just, but a terrible traumatic thing happened to him. When he was in, I believe, when he was being held in Tralee, he got news that 4 men had gone in off the pier in Ballykissan. One of them, I've forgotten the 4 names, was a school pal of his who had been to the national school with him in Monaghan. So he was a childhood friend. The other was a man who was in the same branch, in the Keating branch in the Gaelic League. The third man was a man called McInerney from Limerick, whose father he would have known because there were locals from Abbeyfield. And the fourth man was Charlie Monaghan, who was also in the little grouping in the Gaelic League with him. So there were 4 of his close friends. Now, from there I have no account anywhere of anything that happened to him. From there, for the next official thing I have ever heard was that, I've forgotten the dates, about 5 days before Roger Casement was tried in London, was it Bow Street? I think it was Bow Street. Before he was tried, my father and Austin Stack were tried in the same courtroom. Some of the people who were involved, I have their names, in the trial of Roger Casement were also involved in his trial. But the whole thing about it was that he was a disgrace to have been involved as a member of Her Majesty's government, to be involved in this. The outcome of the court case was, why have that? He was dismissed, naturally, from the civil service, and he was found guilty of treason. I have that written somewhere, and penal servitude for life. I think once the Easter Rising had taken place, he was safe because there was too many of them. When he was in Fronguk, it is very possible that that is the first time he would have met Michael Collins, because he would have been Michael Collins's superior in London in the civil service, but in a different department. Now, I believe that he was very poor health when he came out of jail, and I believe he had a very bad stomach, and they were all released from England. And 144 of them were put on the train from Euston to Dunleary. I have the date. And on that train, they collected other prisoners, and there was 144 of them. I have the list. And I believe that was the first time he ever met Mr. de Valera. When my father arrived in Dublin, I gather now, I'm not very sure about this, but when my father arrived in Dublin, he had planned to go to America. No job, he had planned to go to America with his brothers. And don't forget, the American section in this is always forgotten. Came down home, I think he stayed in Monaghan with his brother. I think he served hay, made hay, came back up to Dublin. I don't know why he came up. Mainly he came up to see his friend Pierce Beasley. And that's when he went up to Harcourt Street and went in to the Sinn Féin office in Harcourt Street, where he met Helena Maloney, all of that crowd, the remnants of what was in London, if you like to put it that way, the remnants of what was there. And the election came up, and he was asked to stand, and he didn't want to stand. He was a complete, reluctant politician. He was an incredibly efficient man, lovely man, but never said he was from the hour he went into it. Though he was very good at it, I believe, but from the hour he went into it, he could see all sorts of things coming. Now, he stood in West Limerick, and in those days, no phones, no telephones, the locality was your world. And you had no hope in rural Ireland of getting anywhere if you weren't a local. And don't forget, at this stage, my father in West Limerick was became a mythical figure. He was never there, but he was one of them. He would come home, meet all the locals, he was gone again. And to put it very simply to you, he was the educated fella. The fella who had got to the top was nowhere. They had nothing, he was only a junior clerk. But he was the fellow who went to London with the pinstripe suit and the bowler hat and the briefcase and the education. So he was, if you like, the hero. Now, I'll sum it all up, and this is a story I got, not from the family, but I got it somewhere else. When my father came home, he was always, even in London, part of him was rural Ireland. When he got home, I don't know whether it was in Dublin or whether it was in Limerick, I think it was in Dublin, he changed out of his pinstripe suit, tall hat, he changed out of all those and got into his local clothes and never appeared in West Limerick in a pinstripe suit, because if he did, he was one of them. You get the picture?
Absolutely.
So when it came to an election, even though he didn't want it, he was the obvious choice. In fact, I think he wanted, there's all sorts of stories told, then he wanted Helen Maloney to go and she wouldn't go, and she was his election agent. They thought that my father would get a seat. There was somebody else running, I've forgotten the name, and that my father might get in as well. And what happened was that my father topped the poll and brought the other men in. And there was nobody more surprised, I would imagine, than he was. I say he was dumb. I say he was the first politician who was ever dumbfounded at his own. I honestly believe that he really was dumbfounded. Because you see, it was the start, if you like, of the local. If you captain the All-Ireland hurling team, you'll be in the next general election, they'll stand you. He attended the first Dáil and the second Dáil and the third one. And actually he and Pierce Beasley were elected to all three. Now, the first Dáil, apparently, at least 3 or 4 efforts at the sitting of that Dáil before the one that we are in 1919. And there were various meetings they had, which they called mini Dáils. I don't know what word they put in them, but there were little Dáils held illegally. Now, when they were held illegally, they were held they could have been stopped any time, so that they had 1 foot in and 1 foot out with the British. And they were trying all the time to prove that they could manage their own affairs in some way or another. They collected money. I don't know where they collected money, but they were afraid that the British government would either take it or they'd discover it or something. But the money they collected was held in Mrs. Barton's account in a bank in Wicklow. That was the story given to me. Dick Barton was part of that grouping, and I think his wife was a hunter. And Mrs. Barton, who was Miss Hunter, I think, they worked something like that, because I was a very, very small boy. God, I was very tiny with my mother when I met them. Because before all this happened, mainly when they were in London, when they were back in Dublin, my father was Sean McEntee's best man. Dick Mulcahy's I can't get this right. It was such a jumble. Dick Mulcahy's second wife was Orion. And I think she was godmother to my eldest brother, who was dead for years. My mother used to complain that she had about 10 godchildren from all of these people. He was De Valera's groomsman at De Valera's wedding. My uncle told me that at another stage, he came down to Limerick to visit Mount Trenchard House. And Mount Trenchard House was the home of the Spring Rices. The last of the Spring Rices, she might have been Margaret, was living there. Most of her time in London. There's a house in London, but this would be kind of the summer house. And he had at least 2 meetings there. They wanted to keep Mary was Spring Rice on board. When the new government came in, they were afraid they'd flee. And they wanted to keep her on board because she was funding the whole thing. She was funding the whole thing. I mean, she was contributing an enormous amount of money. So the story given to me was that my father went down to keep her on board. Very early on, this becomes very difficult. He became terribly disillusioned well before the treaty debates ever took place, because he kind of felt that the whole thing had been mishandled, and that he felt, to put it very bluntly, the game was up with the Unionists. He felt the game was up, even though when he was in London, they were all together, and the biggest Gaelic League was in Belfast, and the Presbyterians were on the Gaelic League and everything. But he felt he didn't know what to do. But his honest belief was that whatever they did, they mustn't sign the treaty. War, no war, anything. And he just said that if we haven't the solution, you just don't do anything because you haven't the solution. I don't know what to do, but you don't do anything. And he voted against the treaty. There was only 4 of them. And he voted against the treaty, and apparently went into very bad favour, because he went very, very bad favour. He voted completely against the treaty and voted, so he left the Dáil. And if you like, De Valera came out with the anti-treaty people, and the others remained inside. And I have a photograph of this, I think. But when he came out, he turned around and refused to ratify De Valera as leader of Fianna Fáil, because he honestly saw what was going to come. He somehow didn't trust him. And he voted against De Valera, voted against, if you like, what was to become Fianna Fáil, and was completely out on a limb, and resigned there and then. They went across to Rathmines, to the La Scala Theatre. There was about 4 or 5 of them. And 4 of them were farmers, or something connected with farming and farming union and that. And they tried to do something, which was a complete disaster. It was called the La Scala Parliament. I think it lasted, I don't know if it lasted a few hours. But literally, that was the end of him. And he was so disillusioned that he had nothing, and came home and had his eye for a little very lovely story on my mother. The 2 of them got married and made a conscious decision that never again would one single word ever be spoken about the whole thing. And he took all his papers and all he ever knew, and the 2 of them, I'm told, burnt them in the fire. All the records, all the everything. And there was a certain amount of family annoyance with that, I believe, that they should have been kept and all the rest of it. But they decided they were going to start a new life, have no more to do with it, and just decided that they were going to start a new life together. My mother had bought a business. She was a highly successful woman, and would kept him, put it as simple as that, if necessary. But he got a job, and I don't know how this was done. When it was all over, he got a job as assistant postmaster in Limerick, and that's where he finished his days, as assistant postmaster in Limerick. My mother had a business. He had, if you like, he was comfortable. My mother became very competent, became a very prosperous woman. She was quite something else. And she kept the whole family together, ran everything, ran him, but they made a conscious decision that never again. But that was the story. Never again would they talk about it. My mother was so heartbroken because it was all so sad. And she was absolutely cuckoo about my father. He was much older than she was, far older. And she knew she wouldn't have long, even when she was married to him. But she was absolutely, and her whole world disappeared. When my father died, she just threw herself completely and utterly into the business.